Hey everyone, this may be the first video that you're seeing for this course. And so I wanted to say hi, I'm your professor, Thomas Eddy, and I am wanting to talk about um, the origin of the profession, landscape architecture. This course is going to be not only, of course, the history of landscape architecture, but we're going to talk about the field in general. If you're new to landscape architecture, this is your opportunity to ask a lot of questions. And I hope that I can help you learn more about the profession. And certainly by learning the history of it, we'll get to a better knowledge and well-rounded perspective of the field. So with that in mind, I want to start with this video where I talk about the influences that created the profession in the United States. And it's not quite how it's represented, at least in the public arena. So, for example, there is a misconception that Frederick Law Olmsted uh, is the father of all landscape architecture, as this the Atlantic quoted is quoted, world's first professional landscape architects. And there's a reason why I have this skeptical child on this first thing, because I want to ask, really, I don't think so. I think there's more to this story that needs to be clarified. So let's look into that. It turns out that the first person, apparently, I haven't seen anything to counter this, but the first person who used the term landscape architecture or landscape architect is actually Gilbert Lang Meeson. He was a merchant and an art critic. He wrote this particular book, which is entitled The Landscape Architecture of the Great Painters of Italy. And what he was looking at, maybe it struck him as interesting, was that the great painters of Italy, whomever they may be, were very good at marrying the architecture in their paintings to the landscape, so that it had this romantic view of the landscape with beautiful buildings in it. So it was very romanticized. And that really, that idea of bringing architecture into the composition in such a way that it's mindful of how it's resting in the landscape is a pretty significant revelation, if you will. Because if the painters didn't do that, then the architecture would just kind of be floating in space, or it would look oddly composed. Why is that building there? Rather than just feeling like it naturally belongs there. So while we're not talking about the profession yet, it was an interesting term that arose from looking at paintings rather than somebody actually doing design work. And in this time, and you'll see long before this, there were designers designing the landscape, but none of them ever called themselves landscape architects, nor did they call it landscape architecture that they were doing. So one thing that I find interesting is that Meeson isn't even acknowledged in our textbook. And I think knowing the root of a profession, you might want to include this information as well. So if that's not the profession, if we're talking about what painters did, then maybe we need to look at some new research that has come out by Nina Antonetti, who looked closely at landscape designer William Andrews Nesfield. And what he did was present a proposal, a design proposal for Buckingham Palace that was adding a new annex, if you will, or a wing, because when you have money, that's what you do, right? You add. And that, of course, means that the landscape around the building needed to be modified as well. Excuse me. And so his proposal was signed by not only himself, but in parentheses just below his name, he put landscape architect. And we think that this is the first time that this profession was identified by somebody. He self-proclaimed himself as a landscape architect. And of course, he went on to that proposal for Buckingham Palace. Well, there were some other political issues that we won't get into here, but it was about the architecture, not about the landscape. But as a consequence, that proposal was never fulfilled in an actual design. But he would go on to do other designs for Castle Howard in the UK, as well as the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew, which is in London, and a lot of other places. And there's mixed reviews about the type of design that he did. But regardless, this looks like the evidence as to where landscape architecture as a profession began. So we can credit the London people, the UK, for that. And it's interesting because at that time, there were other designers, of course, and they were starting to catch on to this idea of being landscape architects. So let's jump back over the pond to where we're at in New York City, where Olmsted and Vaux became partners to work on Central Park. And I think that through the course of their relationship, they realized that Olmsted, being a farmer, administrator, very knowledgeable about the landscape, that was a compliment to Calvert Vaux's profession, which was architecture. And Vaux wasn't interested in being a landscaper, but Olmsted took on that because he had the vision of what the landscape would be. So I'm envisioning that Frederick Law Olmsted had most of the ideas, or at least they were working together on the ideas, but it was Vaux who actually drew up all the plans because that was his expertise. So in that working together, they figured out that they were performing landscape architecture. So I think together, they created the profession in the United States. Now, they were influenced by a lot of things. There were designers before them that were quite famous that also dabbled with that term landscape architecture. But it wasn't until they formulated their partnership and continued on to do more work that they were indeed probably the United States only landscape architecture firm for some time. And I think what is kind of funny is that Olmsted was not a great draftsman, which is hence the reason why he was but he was partnering with Vaux to do their designs. And subsequently, as Olmsted's work progressed in design, he would hire apprentice and even his own stepson to continue with all the drafting. And this is true today with landscape architecture firms. There's the principals of a firm, and they may not be spending a lot of time on the drafting table or in AutoCAD, if you will. And so they will sketch out an idea, pass it on to their staff who might be doing the bulk of the construction drawings and the presentation drawings. So some things don't change. And anyway, Olmsted and Vaux, so I think they are collectively not the world's first landscape architects, but certainly American landscape architects. And this was after after the profession was identified in England. So it's like maybe about 10, 20 years later that they would come up with the professional name. And then Olmsted, not Vaux, Vaux, I should say, Vaux would go on. Their partnership split at some point. And Vaux would go on to continue with his architectural work. But Olmsted would continue to do only landscape architecture. He never had much of an interest in architecture itself. So he went on to, and he became known quite famously for not only Central Park, but the parks in Boston and Chicago Exposition and Stanford and all these places that we're going to be looking at in a little bit more detail. So this is what you need to keep in mind as you study and you read about all the people and places that are in our textbook, because they've been influenced by other people. Nothing really, I've been in this industry for 30 some odd years, and everyone is influenced by something else. It's very, very rare for something to come poof out of the blue. So keep in mind what those influences are as you read the textbook, and we'll talk about those over the course of the semester. So if you want to look at any of the information, certainly I have provided citations and attributions, and when you do your papers that need credit for the research that you're finding, you certainly need to create both citations and attributions where they're appropriate. Okay, so I hope this gives you a quick look at the profession, and let's go on there and from here and see what we can learn. Okay, all right, I hope you like this. Thanks, see you.